Usually when we think about like the origins of a global musical phenomenon, we tend to picture something straight out of a movie.
Oh, definitely. Like a child prodigy sitting at a grand piano or something.
Right. Or a teenager getting a shiny new guitar and just instantly playing like a virtuoso in their pristine, suburban bedroom.
Yeah, there's this expectation of destiny, a clean, straight line from raw talent to inevitable triumph.
Exactly. But then you step into the world of heavy metal, specifically the origins of Black Sabbath, and suddenly that pristine image is just completely shattered.
Oh, shattered into a million pieces. Because it is the absolute definition of a chaotic origin story.
It really is. So, okay, let's unpack this today. How does a dyslexic, perpetually terrified kid from a bleak post-war industrial town with a resume consisting mostly of failed burglaries and slaughterhouse shifts accidentally invent a genre that changed music forever?
It's such a wild question. And today we're taking a deep dive into the incredible, hilarious, and honestly genuinely dark origins of Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath.
And we are pulling straight from the source material for this, right? Excerpts from his autobiography, I Am Ozzy.
Yes. But our mission here isn't just a recap of rock stars' wildlife for you. We really want to examine the mechanics of radical creativity.
Which is fascinating.
It is. We're going to look at how extreme, almost suffocating environmental constraints actually force innovation in ways that, absolute freedom simply can't.
I love that, because to really understand the dark, rebellious, heavy music that would eventually take over the world, you first have to understand the literal rubble it sprang from.
Right. Ozzy wasn't born a rock god. He was born into fear.
We are talking about Aston, Birmingham in the 1950s. And this place was so decimated by German bombing during the Blitz that kids literally played in what they called bomb building sites.
Which is just a crazy phrase.
Right. They honestly thought that's just what playgrounds were called. They didn't know any better.
You really have to picture the sensory reality of that environment for you to grasp it. It was gray, it was unforgiving, and it was cloaked in industrial smog.
And the domestic reality was just as cramped. I mean, he was one of 6 kids shoved into a tiny terraced house.
With no indoor plumbing, by the way. Just a bucket at the end of the bed.
Wow. And his parents worked these grueling factory shifts just to barely scrape by. Plus his poor mother, she was working so hard, but she was no gourmet chef.
No, definitely not.
There's this unbelievable detail in the book where she accidentally boiled a Brillo pad in the cabbage.
Oh my gosh, yes.
His dad sits down, takes a bite, and pulls a tangled steel wire out of his mouth.
It's hilarious in hindsight, but it paints a picture of pure survival mode.
Yeah.
And as tough as home was, school was a literal nightmare for him.
Yeah, because Ozzy had undiagnosed dyslexia and ADHD. He actually said looking at a book was like staring at Chinese.
And in the British school system of that era, neurodivergence wasn't understood at all, let alone accommodated.
Right, there were no special education plans.
No. If you couldn't read, you weren't given tutoring, you were made an example of. The teachers themselves were the primary bullies.
Brutally so. He had this one teacher, Mr. Jones, who would make Ozzy fetch the largest tennis shoe in the room just so the teacher could beat him with it.
It's just horrific.
It is. And one day, the sheer panic and humiliation boiled over, and Ozzy finally snapped. He threw a handful of heavy metal rods straight at the teacher's face.
Which is such a massive turning point, because after that, his coping mechanism completely shifted.
Yeah, he realized he couldn't fight, and he couldn't read, so he just became the extreme class clown.
Exactly. He would do absolutely anything to make the biggest, scariest kids laugh so they wouldn't beat him up.
Which makes so much sense.
It's a critical psychological pivot to understand, because later on, Ozzy's famous madman persona, the crazy guy who will bite the head off a bat or do anything for a reaction.
Right, the stuff everyone knows him for.
Yeah, that wasn't some slick marketing gimmick dreamed up by an A&R guy in a boardroom. It was a trauma response.
There's a literal survival tactic.
Yes, honed on the playground to deflect physical abuse and to mask his own terrifying lack of academic options.
I was thinking about this, and growing up in Aston for Ozzy felt like being trapped in this massive gray maze. And there were only 2 exit doors available to him.
Okay, I like this analogy.
Right. So one door is labeled factory, and the other is labeled prison. And he is just desperately feeling around the walls, hoping to find a secret trapdoor.
I'd actually push back on the idea that they were doors at all.
Oh, really? How come?
Well, they weren't exits. They were just different types of cages. The maze didn't have a built-in escape route.
Oh, I see what you mean.
which meant if he didn't want to be locked inside one of those two cages, he was going to have to blow a hole in the wall himself.
That is such a good point. And because his class clown routine didn't exactly translate into employable skills, he was forced to try those cages.
Yeah, he really tried.
Let's talk about his brief, spectacularly terrible career as a burglar, because this is just comedy gold.
It really is.
He targets this local clothing shop, Sarah Clark's, the first time he forgets to bring a flashlight.
A pretty crucial tool for a burglar.
Right. So he ends up stealing a bunch of baby bibs and toddler underpants in the dark, completely unsellable on the black market.
Go for it.
So he goes back, tries to steal a 24-inch TV, but it's so heavy it falls on him, and he gets pinned in a ditch full of stinging metals for an hour.
The visual of that is incredible. It's almost Chaplin-esque in its physical comedy.
And it gets worse. On the third attempt, he decides to be like a professional and wear gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints.
Naturally.
But one of the gloves is missing a thumb.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so he leaves perfect thumbprints everywhere. The police arrest him, the judge fines him 40 pounds, and his dad absolutely refuses to pay it just to teach him a lesson.
Harsh lesson, yeah.
So Ozzy goes to Winson Green prison for 6 weeks.
And Winson Green was notorious. A violent Victorian-era nightmare.
Oh, it sounds awful.
It served as a massive psychological shock to his system. He was assigned to dole out food, and he witnessed the brutal reality of prison life up close.
Like the porridge incident.
Yes. He watched a notorious child molester get hit in the face with a heavy porridge ladle by another inmate.
Jeez.
That visceral, sudden violence terrified him. He walked out of there completely cured of his criminal ambitions.
You know, it seems to me like being absolutely terrible at burglary was honestly the luckiest break of his life.
How so?
Well, think about it. If he'd remembered a flashlight or had a glove with an actual thumb, maybe he just becomes a successful mid-level thief and we never get Black Sabbath.
It's tempting to view it as a lucky break, for sure. But it was really more of a necessary funneling process.
Funneling him where?
Because failing at crime pushed him into the only remaining cage. The factories. And that is where the aesthetic of heavy metal was truly forged.
Oh, right. Because of the environment.
Exactly. If he's a successful burglar, he never gets immersed in the specific industrial bleakness that shaped his artistic vocabulary.
That makes total sense, because escaping prison just meant entering a different kind of hell for him.
Oh, absolutely.
He gets a job operating a toxic degreasing machine and starts inhaling the fumes to get high, to the point where he's hallucinating and passes out. Fired.
Yeah, not a great employee.
Then his mom gets him a job tuning car horns. Imagine that. 900 horns a day. Beep, honk, blare.
That would drive anyone crazy.
The sheer repetition nearly breaks his mind. So he starts clicking his output counter multiple times for every one horn just to cheat the system. And he gets fired again.
And that relentless funneling finally deposits him in the slaughterhouse.
His slaughterhouse.
Yeah. He starts as a puke remover, literally scooping vomit out of sheep's stomachs, and eventually gets promoted to cow killer.
So grim.
But we need to look at the mechanics of what he was absorbing there. He is covered in blood. He is inhaling the stench of death every single day. And he is listening to the rhythmic, mechanical violence of the slaughter equipment. That sensory input is crucial.
You're saying it directly influenced the music.
Totally. He couldn't have sung about darkness, doom, and industrial decay with such terrifying authenticity later on if he hadn't literally been steeped in it during his formative years.
Wow. So he really had to hit that absolute bottom to realize he needed to build his own escape hatch.
He did.
He looks at his coworker at the car horn factory, this guy named Harry, and Harry is going deaf and just excitedly waiting to get a gold watch for 30 years of service.
What a bleak future.
Right. And Ozzy sees Harry and realizes, if I don't do something drastic, that is my entire future.
So what does he do?
Well, the spark to build that escape hatch actually comes from the Beatles. He hears their music and realizes these working class guys from a grim port town like Liverpool found a way out.
The Beatles showed him it was possible.
Exactly. So he puts an ad in a local music shop window, and it just says, OZZYZ, Zeej needs gig.
Which is just a great ad. And that was funded entirely by his father, by the way.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, his dad bought him a PA system despite thinking the Beatles had, quote, no tunes.
That's hilarious. No tunes.
But his father understood desperation.
He really did. And that little ad acts like a magnet for the ultimate ragtag group of Aston misfits.
The original lineup.
Yep. You get Geezer Butler, who is this smart, vegetarian trainee accountant who wears lime green bell-bottoms and writes poetry about black magic.
Quite the combo.
Then you get Bill Ward, this incredibly down-to-earth drummer who drinks farm cider out of grocery bags. And crucially, the ad reunites Ozzy with Tony Iommi.
Tony was the intimidating older kid from school who had initially rejected Ozzy, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But by the time they reconnected, Tony had suffered a physical tragedy that would, ironically, dictate the entire sonic direction of the genre they were about to create.
Okay, for anyone listening right now, think about the biggest constraint or setback in your own career. We usually view those as career enders.
Right, something you can't come back from.
Exactly. But for Tony, a literal physical mutilation is what forced him to invent a genre. He is working his very last day at a sheet metal factory before leaving to become a professional guitarist.
His last day.
His last day. And the massive metal press comes down and severs the fingertips off his right hand, his fretting hand. The doctors literally tell him he will never play guitar again.
It's a devastating moment. I mean, your whole dream just crushed in a machine.
Literally.
But his boss plays him a record by Django Reinhardt, who had pioneered a jazz guitar style, using only 2 working fingers after a terrible fire.
Which is just incredible.
It is. And inspired by the fact that it was physically possible to adapt, Tony refuses to quit. But he has to engineer a solution.
And what he comes up with is so creative.
He melts down plastic fairy liquid soap bottles, forms them into little thimbles for his severed fingers, and glues leather to the end so he can grip the strings.
But I mean, even with the thimbles pressing down on standard guitar strings was agonizingly painful, right?
Exactly. And this is where the mechanics of the heavy metal sound are born.
Okay, tell me more.
To ease the tension on his damaged fingers, Tony detunes his guitar strings. When you lower the tuning of a guitar, the strings become physically looser, making them easier to press. But sonically, looser strings vibrate differently. They produce a thicker, heavier, sludgier tone with much more low-end resonance.
It's like a dark superpower. He gets mangled by industrial machinery, and instead of quitting, he gains the heaviest guitar tone in human history.
It's amazing.
That iconic booming sound wasn't a creative choice initially. It was born out of pure physical necessity to avoid pain.
The irony is profound. The very industrial machine that threatened to trap them in working-class obscurity physically altered Tony.
Wow.
It forced him to invent the exact musical mechanics that would eventually save them all.
That is wild. Okay, so they have the sound, they have the band, but for a while, they are still just playing standard upbeat blues covers.
Yeah, they hadn't found their true identity yet.
Not at all. They're starving, driving around Europe in a freezing, broken-down van where they have to manually operate the windshield wipers with a piece of string.
So glamorous.
Oh, totally. They're playing residencies in Hamburg, getting by on speed and stolen raw vegetables. There's even a moment where Ozzy finds a perfectly ironed Nazi uniform in a groupie's closet.
Oh boy.
And he struts around her apartment in it as a prank until she chases him out with a broom. I mean, they are completely directionless.
And their lack of identity was obvious in their early band names too. They called themselves the Polka Tulk Blues Band.
Polka Tulk.
Yeah, named after a cheap brand of talcum powder Ozzy's mom used. And later, they just went by Earth.
Imagine a heavy metal band called Polka Tulk.
Doesn't quite have the same ring to it.
No. But the epiphany finally comes when they are rehearsing across the street from the Orient Cinema in Birmingham.
This is such a great moment.
There is a massive line of people waiting to see a horror movie. And Tony looks out the window and observes, "Isn't it strange how people pay money to frighten themselves?"
Right.
He says maybe we should stop doing blues and write scary music.
That simple psychological observation changed everything for them. Geezer Butler had a title from an old Boris Karloff movie, Black Sabbath.
The perfect name.
And to match the concept, Tony comes up with this heavy, lumbering riff that utilizes the tritone.
The tritone, what's that?
So, to understand why this works so well, you have to look at the mechanics of the tritone. It's a musical interval, a flatted fifth that is highly dissonant.
Okay.
Human ears naturally crave musical resolution. We want a chord to sound complete and settled, but the tritone actively denies that resolution.
Oh, interesting.
It feels structurally unstable and physically unsettling. It was historically known as the devil's interval precisely because it evokes a feeling of impending doom.
That is so cool. And when they finally play this new song, Black Sabbath, live for the first time, the girls in the audience literally run out of the venue screaming.
Mission accomplished, right?
Well, Ozzy actually complains to the band. He's like, isn't the whole point of being in a band to get girls, not make them run away?
That's such an Ozzy reaction.
It really is. But they quickly realize the power of what they've tapped into. They embrace the darkness and officially change their name to Black Sabbath.
A huge turning point.
But this makes me wonder, were the architects of occult rock essentially just savvy businessmen?
What do you mean?
Did they just cynically figure out a gimmick to stand out from bands playing songs like Mellow Yellow?
Calling them cynical businessmen entirely oversimplifies it. They didn't invent the darkness as a purely calculated marketing ploy.
Okay, so it was genuine.
Yeah, they just finally recognized what resonated with their own grim reality. Look at the context of the late 1960s. The mainstream counterculture was the hippie movement.
Right, flower power.
Exactly. It was all about wearing flowers in your hair in San Francisco and peace and love. But if you were a kid growing up it didn't reflect your reality at all. Black Sabbath were just four guys reflecting the grimness of their actual world back to an audience that was hungry for something heavier, something honest.
And that honesty paid off instantaneously. They go from playing to a handful of people in pubs to rocketing into the terrifying, hilarious, and completely overwhelming world of international stardom.
Their rise was incredibly fast, which left them totally unprepared.
I can imagine.
They go into the studio and record their entire debut album in roughly 12 hours.
12 hours?
Yeah, they basically just set up their live gear, played their set, and hit record. It cost a few £100s.
Wow.
And that iconic, terrifying album covered the sickly-looking woman in the black cloak standing in front of the watermill with an inverted cross inside the sleeve. The band had zero input on that.
The record company just handed it to them and they thought it looked cool.
Yep.
And the story behind their biggest hit, Paranoid, is even wilder. They're in the studio recording their second album, and the producer says, hey, we're a few minutes short, we need some filler.
Just some filler.
Right. So Tony plays a riff, Ozzy hums a melody, Geezer scribbles some lyrics, and they throw Paranoid together in 20 minutes.
And it becomes a massive hit.
It shoots up the charts and gets them on top of the pops.
Yeah.
Writing Paranoid as filler is like quickly scribbling a grocery list on a napkin and accidentally writing the Magna Carta.
That's a great way to put it.
They didn't even care about the song, and it defined their entire career.
It perfectly captures the paradox of their early success. The music was incredibly organic, pouring out of them effortlessly because it was so deeply ingrained in who they were.
Right.
But that sudden success immediately threw them into a machine far more dangerous than the factories of Aston, the 1970s music business.
The culture shock alone was insane. They go to America for the first time, and Ozzy discovers pizza, which absolutely blows his mind.
Naturally.
He goes home to England and tries to recreate it for his first wife, Thelma, by baking bread covered in baked beans and pilchards.
Oh, disgusting.
Unsurprisingly, she was not impressed.
But alongside the funny culture shock came the darker reality of their new image. Because their music didn't wink at the audience because it felt so genuinely heavy and real, the satanic panic attached itself to them fiercely.
Yeah, they couldn't escape it.
They were relentlessly harassed by actual occultists who thought the band were their dark messiahs.
Yeah, like in Memphis, a guy in a black cloak jumps on stage with a dagger, and one of their roadies has to tackle him and hit him with a metal bar.
Terrifying.
Another time, Ozzy walks out of his hotel room, and there's a literal coven of Satanists sitting in a circle in the hallway with black robes and candles.
What do you even do in that situation?
Well, Ozzy, in classic Ozzy fashion, just sits down, blows out their candles, and sings happy birthday to them until they get mad and leave.
That is a hilarious reaction, but it really highlights how utterly unequipped they were for the world they had entered. And that naivete was heavily exploited.
By the industry.
Yes. We have to look at how music management worked back then. They achieved unimaginable wealth on paper, but they were preyed upon by managers like Don Arden and Patrick Meehan.
How did they do it?
These managers utilized a specific financial trap. They didn't pay the band proper structured salaries. Instead, they paid their expenses.
Meaning they kept them financially illiterate.
Precisely. If Ozzy wanted a Rolls Royce, the manager would say, go pick one out, we'll take care of it.
Right, so it felt like unlimited money.
The band thought they were impossibly rich because they had limitless tabs at the bar and a never-ending supply of drugs. but the managers own the actual assets.
Ah, I see.
They own the publishing, the master recordings, the houses. They were bleeding the band's finances dry while keeping them entirely docile with excess.
That's so manipulative.
Ozzy mentions in the book that his ego spiraled out of control, fueled by the drugs and the enablers, which deeply alienated him from his family.
The cruel irony is staggering. They literally built their own escape hatch to get out of the physical factories of Aston, only to become cogs in the corporate music factory.
Yeah, which was far more insidious because it was disguised as luxury.
Exactly. The very success that freed them trapped them in a cycle of addiction and financial exploitation that took them decades to untangle.
It's a tragic part of the story, really.
So when we pull all of this together, what are we left with? We started with a dyslexic kid stealing baby bibs in the dark and a sheet metal worker whose fingertips were crushed by a machine.
A bunch of absolute misfits.
And against all odds, they end up as the founding fathers of a musical genre that changed global culture forever. They refused to accept the bleak destiny that Aston handed them, and they built their own exit door out of pure, heavy noise.
It is a remarkable journey of survival and adaptation. And it leaves us with an interesting paradox to consider, especially today.
What's that?
Well, we live in an era where music production is incredibly accessible. For you or anyone listening, you can sit in a comfortable, pristine suburban bedroom, open a laptop, and use digital software to create perfectly tuned, flawless audio.
Right, without ever touching a physical instrument.
Exactly. Yeah. But it makes you wonder, as we remove all the physical friction and engineer out the flaws, have we also engineered out the absolute desperation required to force a true cultural paradigm shift?
Oh, wow.
Could something as revolutionary and visceral as heavy metal even be invented today without the grit, the grime, and the crushed fingertips of an unforgiving reality pushing against it?
That completely reframes how we look at the conveniences we have now. You look for that clean, visible line of genius in a pristine bedroom, but what you actually find in the history books is a messy, muddy landscape of failure, accidents, and survival.
And out of that mud, they built something indestructible.
Perfectly said. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. To everyone listening, keep questioning the origins of the things you love, and we will see you next time.